On February 16, 1945, the first light touched the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima. In the pale morning sky, the silence above the Pacific shattered as silver silhouettes pierced through the mist. They were P-51 Mustangs, newly arrived, sleek and utterly alien to the Japanese defenders below. Inside a hardened bunker near Mount Suribachi, Japanese officers watched through binoculars, their faces calm but certain. For years, the Zero had been the unrivaled master of these skies. American planes were heavier, slower, clumsier, easy prey for their seasoned pilots. The officers chuckled at the thought that these newcomers could change anything. But moments later, the laughter faded. The Mustangs climbed higher than any Zero could reach, then dove with surgical precision. Within minutes, the air defense perimeter faltered. Black smoke twisted upward as the myth of Japanese air invincibility began to crumble. That morning marked more than a dogfight. It marked the turning of the Pacific sky itself. What began as mockery ended in disbelief, as a machine born in desperation began rewriting the final chapters of the war. In the early months of the Pacific War, the skies belonged to Japan. From December 1941 to mid-1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service ruled the vast oceanic theater with a confidence that bordered on myth. Their aircraft, especially the Mitsubishi S6M0, seemed almost untouchable, fast, agile, and devastatingly effective in the hands of highly trained pilots who had honed their craft since the war in China. When the attack on Pearl Harbor erupted, the world witnessed not only Japan's boldness but its technological edge in aerial warfare. The Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly farther than nearly any Allied aircraft in existence. Its pilots, many veterans of dogfights over Nanking and the South China Sea, possessed a discipline and experience that left new American aviators outmatched. Over the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma, Allied pilots learned a cruel lesson. That courage meant little against an enemy whose machine could twist inside your turn and strike before you even sighted him. Reports flooded in of Zeros appearing out of nowhere, outclimbing and outmaneuvering everything the Americans and British could throw into the fight. For nearly 2 years, the Zero reigned supreme, and with it came a deep psychological dominance. Early American aircraft, the P-40 Warhawk, the F-4F Wildcat, and the P-39 Airacobra, struggled to close the gap. They were heavier, less responsive, and lacked the range to patrol the immense Pacific expanses. Pilots flew with desperate innovation, using dive tactics, hit-and-run passes, and teamwork to compensate for mechanical inferiority. But the losses were relentless. By late 1942, the American military knew that the war in the Pacific would not be won with bravery alone. Technology had to evolve, and fast. Factories across the United States began rethinking what a fighter aircraft should be. The key question emerged. How could they build a machine capable of crossing oceans, escorting bombers, and still fighting toe-to-toe with the agile Japanese fighters that had humiliated them from the skies of the Coral Sea to Guadalcanal? At the same time, the Japanese high command began to succumb to the illusion of permanence. Victories had come so easily that a quiet arrogance took hold. Engineers were ordered to refine the Zero rather than replace it. Its light frame, once its greatest asset, became a fatal flaw as Allied firepower increased. But in 1942, that vulnerability was still hidden. The belief persisted that no Western aircraft could ever challenge their creation. For American pilots, survival became a matter of learning through loss. Each sortie brought new insights. The Zero could not dive at high speed without losing control. It lacked armor protection. Its fuel tanks ignited easily. Slowly, tacticians began to carve a method from chaos. The war in the air was shifting from emotion to engineering, from courage to calculation. In Washington and London, aircraft designers studied the grim reports pouring in from the Pacific and European fronts. They needed something revolutionary, a fighter with range, speed, and altitude performance that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. A machine that could bridge continents and dominate at every level of flight. The answer would not come from a massive military contractor, but from a relatively small company in California, North American Aviation. In the fall of 1940, before America had even entered the war, the British approached them with a request. design a new fighter as quickly as possible. What followed was one of the most remarkable engineering races in aviation history, one that would ultimately decide who ruled the skies above both Europe and the Pacific. By 1943, as American bombers suffered catastrophic losses over Europe, a new prototype began to draw attention. It was unlike anything before, sleek, fast, efficient. Yet its true potential remained hidden, waiting for the perfect combination of power and design. That combination would emerge soon, in the form of a British engine mated to an American airframe, giving birth to a machine that would redefine aerial warfare. The Pacific still burned under Japanese control, but whispers of change had begun. Somewhere across the ocean, engineers were drafting the lines of a fighter that would end an era of Japanese laughter and replace it with silence. In 1940, when Britain faced the full fury of the Luftwaffe, the Royal Air Force was desperate for new fighters. They approached North American aviation not for innovation, but for speed of delivery, a quick replacement for the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. What they received instead was a revelation. Within just 117 days, North Americans engineers, led by Edgar Schmud, designed a prototype that looked and behaved unlike any aircraft of its time. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag, its lines were fluid and aerodynamic, and its frame was built for endurance. The British named it the Mustang Mki. When it first flew in October 1940, it impressed observers with its range and low-altitude speed, but something was missing. At higher altitudes, where most modern dogfights occurred, its Allison engine gasped for power. The Americans initially dismissed it. The Mustang entered limited service, performing reconnaissance and ground attack roles. It was efficient, sturdy, and promising, yet no one saw it as a world-changing weapon. That perception would alter in 1942, when British engineers decided to fit the American airframe with their own jewel of engineering, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The transformation was immediate and astonishing. The Mustang now soared past 400 miles per hour, climbed effortlessly above 30,000 feet, and retained fuel efficiency unmatched by any Allied fighter. With the Packard-built Merlin V1650, produced under license in the U.S., the P-51 became not just a new aircraft, it became a symbol of Allied ingenuity, a literal fusion of British precision and American industrial power. By 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces were bleeding over Europe. B-17 and B-24 bombers flew deep into Germany without effective long-range escorts. Losses were staggering. Entire formations vanished over the Ruhr and Berlin. The arrival of the P-51 changed everything. Its range stretched beyond 1,600 kilometers with drop tanks, allowing it to fly with the bombers all the way to the target and back. Suddenly, the hunter had protection. The Luftwaffe's dominance began to erode, replaced by the steady presence of these sleek silver guardians above the clouds. The European victories, however, only told half the story. Across the Pacific, a very different kind of battle raged. Distance was the real enemy, islands separated by hundreds of miles of ocean. Fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair held the line, but they were carrier-based and limited in reach. The strategic bombing of Japan, the final stage of the Pacific Air War, required something far greater, an aircraft that could escort bombers from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back again. By late 1944, General Henry Hap Arnold approved the transfer of P-51 units to the Pacific Theater. The 15th and 21st Fighter Groups began arriving at newly captured airfields in the Marianas and the Bonin Islands. The Mustang's long legs made it the perfect companion for the B-29 Superfortress, the flying fortress tasked with breaking Japan's industrial backbone. For Japanese pilots, the shift was almost imperceptible at first. They noticed unfamiliar contrails high above, too distant to intercept. Then, one morning over Formosa, the first Mustangs engaged. Their speed and dive power shocked the defenders, who were used to lumbering American bombers and slower escorts. The P-51s didn't dance in tight circles like the Zeros. They struck once, vanished into the sun, and returned from impossible angles. The Japanese command assumed it was luck. It wasn't. As the P-51s spread through the Pacific, they brought with them a new philosophy of air combat. The age of lightly built dogfighters was over. The Mustang represented endurance, altitude, and precision, the future of warfare where fuel range and speed dictated survival. In Tokyo, reports of these new American aircraft arrived with disbelief. Officers scoffed at the idea that Western machines could outfly the Zero in its own domain. Pilots were ordered to attack with spirit, the same creed that had once carried Japan to victory. But by early 1945, the spirit was meeting something unstoppable: mathematics, metallurgy, and mass production. The Mustang wasn't just a plane, it was the physical embodiment of industrial momentum. Each one carried the weight of a nation that had learned from its defeats and turned engineering into strategy. As February dawned over Iwo Jima, the stage was set for confrontation. Japanese officers still trusted in the old order, that no American pilot could match their skill, that no foreign machine could rival the Zero. Within days, that illusion would meet the cold clarity of aluminum and fire. And when the first P-51 squadrons thundered through the morning haze above Iwo Jima, they brought more than airplanes, they brought the end of an era. For the men who flew the P-51 Mustang, the war was no longer about revenge or pride, it was about endurance. The Pacific was a graveyard of aircraft and ambition, where fuel gauges determined life or death more often than enemy bullets. Yet when the Mustangs arrived, the airmen of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups discovered something they hadn't felt in years: confidence. Their training was rigorous, built on painful lessons from the early defeats of 1942. Every pilot knew the statistics: how the Zero could outturn almost anything below 20,000 feet, how Japanese pilots favored head-on attacks, how even a single mistake meant vanishing into the endless sea. The arrival of the Mustang changed the rhythm of the air war. For the first time, Americans didn't have to wait to be attacked, they could dictate the fight. The P-51's exceptional range meant pilots could accompany bombers all the way from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, a 6-hour round trip across open water. The long, monotonous flight was broken only by the hum of the Merlin engine and the quiet tension of anticipation. Then, somewhere near the Japanese mainland, the static-filled radio crackled: enemy contacts ahead. The Mustangs climbed to meet them. Tactically, the Mustang's superiority was rooted not just in its speed, but in how it rewrote the geometry of combat. Unlike the tight, swirling engagements of early war dogfights, the P-51 introduced a vertical battlefield. Pilots learned to fight in altitude, not circles, using their climb rate and dive energy to strike from above and escape before their opponent could react. The Mustang was not about maneuvering with the enemy, it was about dominating him. Veterans recalled the first encounters over the home islands with astonishment. Japanese fighters would turn sharply, hoping to bait the Mustangs into a chase. But instead, the P-51 simply zoomed upward, rolled inverted, and dove again from thousands of feet higher. The Zero, so deadly at low speed, could not follow. Its airframe, built for agility, tore apart under high-speed stress. In those moments, Japanese pilots realized they were fighting a machine that obeyed a different set of physics. Humanly, the shift was profound. The generation of American pilots who entered the war after Pearl Harbor had grown up hearing stories of defeat, of friends lost in burning Wildcats, of hopeless duels over the Coral Sea. But in 1945, as the P-51's shadow passed across the Pacific, they were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. Each squadron developed its own identity. Some decorated their Mustangs with nose art, bold insignias of home, women, or vengeance. Others flew them bare, their polished aluminum reflecting sunlight like mirrors over the Pacific. Beneath the aesthetics lay a deeper transformation. The pilots now trusted their machines. They had something capable of taking them home. The Japanese, meanwhile, were trapped between valor and exhaustion. Their pilot corps, once the envy of the world, had been decimated. By 1945, many replacements had barely 100 flight hours before being sent into combat. The gulf between veteran and novice widened with every battle. The Americans, now backed by endless training and resources, faced opponents who were running out of everything: fuel, planes, and time. Tactically, the Mustangs learned discipline. Engagements were not about individual heroism but teamwork. Pairs and flights working in coordination, protecting each other's tails, and moving as extensions of a single will. The Japanese still fought with courage, but courage without coordination could no longer win the day. The most striking difference lay in mentality. Japanese doctrine preached that spirit conquers steel. American pilots had learned that steel, when perfected, conquered everything. The Mustang represented that philosophy, not arrogance, but precision. Every flight was calculated, every dive measured. The days of chaotic dogfighting were over. War had entered the realm of systems and science. Still, even in victory, there was humanity. Pilots who shot down enemy aircraft often watched their foes descend in spirals of flame and smoke, knowing full well that the men inside were not so different. Disciplined, patriotic, convinced of their duty. Some Mustang pilots later admitted they felt no joy, only relief. The Pacific was vast and empty, and survival was triumph enough. Each mission ended the same way. The long flight back to Iwo Jima, the dim glow of the island runway flickering through the clouds. Some planes returned riddled with holes. Others never returned at all. Yet the mood had changed. The Americans now owned the sky, and every pilot knew it. By the spring of 1945, the Mustang's legend had become undeniable. Japanese squadrons began avoiding high-altitude combat altogether, preferring to attack bombers at low level or by night. The myth of the Zero's supremacy had evaporated, replaced by the sound of a Merlin engine echoing through the Pacific dawn. The human story of the Mustang was not just about victory. It was about redemption. From the ashes of early defeat rose a generation of aviators who understood that wars are not won by pride, but by progress. And every time a P-51 streaked across the horizon, it carried with it that truth, silent, silver, and absolute. But the Mustang's legacy was not defined only by its pilots. Its true brilliance lay in its design, a fusion of science and intuition that made it the most efficient killing machine of its era. And as American engineers studied the wreckage of Japanese aircraft, they realized something profound. Technology had already outpaced tradition. At its heart, the P-51 Mustang was not a miracle, it was mathematics turned to muscle. Every curve of its frame, every rivet in its skin, reflected a calculation aimed at one purpose: sustained superiority. The laminar flow wing, a first of its kind, sliced the air with minimal resistance, allowing greater speed without demanding more power. Engineers had crafted a machine that could dance with the atmosphere itself. Underneath its polished skin lay the secret that reshaped the Pacific War, the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650. With a two-stage supercharger, it maintained full power even at high altitudes where the Japanese engines gasped for breath. Above 30,000 feet, where the B-29s cruised toward Japan's industrial heartland, the Mustang thrived. Could escort, fight, and return with fuel to spare. That endurance made it the bridge between island and empire, between bomber and target. Japanese engineers, once at the forefront of aeronautical design, found themselves cornered by the relentless pace of Allied industry. The Zero, though legendary, had been conceived for a different age, one where agility trumped armor and range outweighed resilience. It was light, elegant, and deadly in its prime. But by 1945, its fabric-covered control surfaces and lack of self-sealing fuel tanks made it an antique. A single burst from a Mustang's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns could shred its frame in an instant. While American factories turned out thousands of aircraft every month, Japanese production struggled under the weight of blockade and bombardment. Aluminum shortages, fuel scarcity, and the destruction of transport networks meant even superior designs, like the Nakajima Ki 84H8 and Kawanishi N1K2J Shidenkai, could never appear in sufficient numbers. Leadership decisions within the Japanese high command worsened the crisis. Many officers refused to acknowledge that the Zero's reign was over. In Tokyo, air defense meetings turned into debates between engineers and traditionalists. The engineers demanded heavier armament and better armor. The officers countered with philosophy that the Japanese pilot's spirit was more important than material strength. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Americans had learned that spirit alone could not stop bullets. Meanwhile, U.S. leadership embraced pragmatism. Generals like Hap Arnold and Carl Spaatz understood that technology, when properly deployed, could shorten wars. They placed their faith in systems, not superstition. The Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a component in a grand logistical machine, a moving part in a synchronized war of industry. Each mission from Iwo Jima to Japan followed a rhythm of precision. B-29 bombers climbed in tight formation, their silver skins glinting in the early light. Above them, the P-51s spread out in escort wings, maintaining radio silence, conserving fuel. It was engineering choreography, executed across hundreds of miles. Japanese interceptors scrambled from airfields around Honshu and Kyushu, only to find themselves swarmed by aircraft they could neither outclimb nor outrun. To the Japanese officers who watched these engagements from the ground, the transformation seemed almost supernatural. Reports described American fighters diving from impossible altitudes, striking and disappearing before the defenders could respond. Pilots who survived engagements spoke of a silver ghost, fast, merciless, untouchable. The shock was not just technical. It was cultural. The Empire's air power, once a symbol of divine favor, was now being erased by foreign machines that embodied cold, mechanical logic. The psychological collapse was as significant as the material one. Intelligence intercepts later revealed growing despair in Japanese pilot communications, frustration over inadequate aircraft, disbelief at the Mustang's speed, and resignation in the face of mounting losses. What once had been laughter in officer clubs turned to uneasy silence. Technologically, the Mustang's genius also lay in its simplicity. It could be built quickly, maintained easily, and adapted for multiple theaters. The same airframe that battled Messerschmitts over Germany now roared above the Pacific, modified with tropical filters and extended-range fuel tanks. That versatility gave the Allies something Japan could no longer match: strategic flexibility. Even the smallest details reflected foresight. The Mustang's bubble canopy offered near-total visibility, eliminating blind spots that once doomed pilots in dogfights. Its radio equipment allowed coordination across vast distances, enabling formations to act as one. Every improvement, from gunsight to fuel mixture control, represented a quiet revolution born from necessity and experience. By early 1945, Japanese commanders could no longer deny the truth. Reports from Iwo Jima and Formosa confirmed that the new American fighters were operating freely over the home islands. "We have lost control of the air," one staff officer wrote bluntly in March. "Our fighters are destroyed faster than we can replace them." The Emperor's sky, once sacred, now belonged to the invader. But perhaps the most telling contrast was between leadership philosophies. The Americans trusted data, test flights, engine output charts, and pilot debriefings. The Japanese trusted faith. One side evolved, the other endured. The outcome was inevitable. Yet even in defeat, there was dignity. Japanese pilots continued to take off, knowing they faced impossible odds. Their courage remained unbroken, even as the weapons of their enemies outpaced the dreams of their designers. In their final sorties, many still flew Zeros, outdated, fragile, but flown with the same precision that once terrified the Pacific. Above them, the Mustangs ruled, engines steady, wings gleaming in the rising sun. They had become more than aircraft. They were instruments of transition, heralds of a world where war would be decided not by tradition or emotion, but by the quiet efficiency of human innovation. And as the final weeks of the Pacific Air War approached, those instruments were about to deliver the decisive blow, the moment when air superiority would become absolute, and the Japanese Empire would face its reckoning from above. On February 19, 1945, as the first wave of Marines stormed the black sands of Iwo Jima, the air above the island roared with a different battle. Clouds hung low, torn by contrails that streaked like silver scars across the morning sky. The P-51 Mustangs of the 15th Fighter Group, operating from newly secured strips in the Marianas, arrived to sweep the air clean for the invasion fleet below. At dawn, radar picked up movement from the north, a formation of Japanese fighters rising from Chichijima. They came fast and confident, their commanders convinced they still ruled these skies. For years, Japanese pilots had fought over territory where the Zero's agility was law. But now their enemy came from higher, faster, deadlier. The Mustang's Merlin engines hummed with a deep mechanical steadiness that betrayed no strain, no hesitation. The two formations met over the island's volcanic ridge. Lieutenant Robert Amos, flying lead in the Enchantress, spotted the enemy first. He signaled his flight, rolled inverted, and dove. The air screamed past the canopy as gravity and horsepower merged into a single, unstoppable plunge. Below, the Japanese formation fractured. Their Zeros broke to evade, but the Mustangs were already upon them. Gun camera footage from that morning shows the truth of the new age. The bursts came quick, controlled, precise. 6.50 caliber guns stitched across the sky, and what had once been graceful, untouchable aircraft now erupted into flame. The Zeros that survived tried to climb away, but the Mustangs followed effortlessly. Speed, altitude, and momentum had become weapons in themselves. Within minutes, the air above Iwo Jima belonged to the Americans. For the Japanese commanders watching from bunkers carved into the cliffs, disbelief set in. Their pilots had always been their pride, sharp, disciplined, unbeatable. Yet these new enemy fighters seemed to move in ways physics should not allow. Reports described the Mustangs diving from altitudes the Zeros could never reach, firing with uncanny precision, and vanishing into the clouds before counterattack was possible. It was not just defeat, it was revelation. As the battle for Iwo Jima raged below, the Mustangs' true mission unfolded, the securing of airfields that would bring Tokyo itself within reach. Captured strips like Motoyama No. 1 and No. 2 were quickly repaired by U.S. engineers, and within days, the first P-51s were touching down on the island's scorched surface. For the men of the 506th and 21st Fighter Groups, this was sacred ground, a place from which they would launch history's most audacious air campaign. From Iwo Jima, the Mustangs could finally escort the B-29 superfortresses all the way to Japan and back. It was a tactical revolution, something Japan had never imagined possible. Before the Mustang, bomber crews flew alone into the heart of the empire, facing relentless interception and catastrophic loss. Now, silver wings stretched beside them the entire way. The first long-range mission to Tokyo took place on April 7, 1945. At 0700 hours, nearly 100 P-51s rose from Iwo Jima alongside waves of B-29s. Their destination, Nakajima Aircraft Works, Japan's largest military production complex. The flight lasted nearly 7 hours, an eternity of ocean and silence. Then, the coastline appeared, and the Mustangs dove through scattered clouds into the smoke-filled skies of Tokyo. Japanese defenders scrambled in disarray. Their radar stations, crippled by previous bombings, barely registered the incoming armada before the first bombs fell. When their fighters finally reached altitude, they met the P-51s head-on. What followed was chaos. A sky filled with vapor trails, tracer fire, and explosions that painted the clouds red. For every Zero that appeared, 2 or 3 Mustangs countered. The radio chatter from that day, later transcribed from combat recordings, carried the calm precision of professionals at work. Red 2, tally-ho at 3 o'clock. Brake left, splash 10. Escort intact. Continue sweep. There was no bravado, no shouting. The Americans had reached a new rhythm, a cold, mechanical efficiency that mirrored the precision of the machines they flew. Below, Tokyo burned. From 30,000 feet, the Mustang pilots could see the smoke rising in pillars that merged into a single black shroud over the city. They didn't cheer. They just turned for home. When they landed back on Iwo Jima, many of them silent and pale from exhaustion, the truth was clear. Japan's last line of aerial defense had been broken. The Empire's skies, once a fortress, had become corridors for the enemy. Yet, even in triumph, there lingered a quiet respect. Some pilots later admitted they admired the courage of their Japanese counterparts. Men who flew obsolete machines against overwhelming odds, knowing the outcome before takeoff. That respect, however, did not alter the reality that the age of the Zero had ended. The Mustangs' victory at Iwo Jima and over Tokyo was not a single battle. It was a shift in the nature of warfare. Air supremacy was no longer earned by daring or legend. It was engineered. But the Pacific still had one final storm left to break. a confrontation that would seal Japan's fate from the air and end centuries of warrior pride with the roar of American engines. By May 1945, the once untouchable Japanese sky had become a hunting ground. The P-51 Mustangs, operating from Iwo Jima in relentless waves, flew mission after mission deep into the empire's heart. Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, each city saw their silver contrails stretch across the morning sky before the thunder began. The 506th, 21st, and 15th Fighter Groups flew escort and strafing missions that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Flights often lasted 7 or 8 hours, with pilots sitting in narrow cockpits, their bodies stiff, their minds sharpened to a mechanical calm. The roar of the Merlin engine became both companion and shield, a constant sound that meant survival. When the engine faltered, silence was death. Japanese interceptors scrambled when fuel and manpower allowed, but each encounter ended the same. The Zeros, now outdated and fragile, could not compete in altitude, speed, or firepower. Their once-feared turning ability was meaningless against opponents who refused to enter the old dance of dogfighting. Mustang pilots struck from above and vanished. When the Japanese tried to climb, their engines overheated or failed entirely. By June, Japanese airfields were littered with burned-out wrecks. American reconnaissance photographs showed runways pocked with bomb craters and hangars reduced to frames of twisted steel. Yet still, from the remnants of those airbases, a few pilots continued to rise. Among them were boys barely out of training, flying machines held together with scavenged parts. They faced an enemy that was not merely superior, it was unstoppable. One of the most devastating missions occurred on July 10, 1945. Nearly 500 Mustangs and bombers struck targets across Honshu. Over 130 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, many before they even left the ground. The following day, Tokyo's skies were empty. The once formidable air defense network was now a shadow, operating in fragments. Reports from Japanese command admitted the unthinkable. We no longer control our own airspace. For the Americans, the air war had become a grim routine. Pilots flew over cities already reduced to ash, their targets more logistical than strategic: rail yards, fuel depots, airfields. There were few aerial opponents left. Some Mustangs returned from missions without firing a shot. Yet the danger never vanished. Mechanical failure, weather, and flak claimed lives with relentless indifference. In the brief calm between sorties, pilots wrote letters in their tents on Iwo Jima. Many spoke not of glory but of fatigue, a strange exhaustion that came from victory itself. They had achieved total air dominance, but the sight of burning cities and parachutes trailing smoke had stripped the triumph of joy. "We're killing ghosts now," one pilot wrote in July. "The fight is gone out of them." Inside Japan, the sense of doom deepened. Intercepted communications revealed despair among air units. "Their planes come from nowhere," one pilot radioed before his transmission was cut off. Ground observers began referring to the Mustangs as Shinen no Tsubasa, wings from the abyss. The psychological warfare was complete. Even the kamikaze attacks, once the embodiment of Japan's desperate resolve, began to falter. The P-51s intercepted many before they could reach their targets, cutting down attackers miles from the invasion fleets. The sacrifice continued, but its effect diminished. The skies over Japan had turned from battlefield to execution ground. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima now became fully apparent. Each Mustang sortie not only protected the bombers but also rescued downed crews. Before its capture, thousands of B-29 crewmen had been lost at sea after ditching between Japan and the Marianas. After Iwo Jima's airfields came online, those losses fell dramatically. The island that had cost nearly 7,000 marine lives was repaying its blood price in the currency of survival. As July turned to August, Japan's air command ceased to function as a centralized force. Radar coverage had collapsed, fuel depots were destroyed, and aircraft production had ground to a halt. The once proud fighter wings of the Imperial Navy were now isolated pockets of resistance, many with no functioning aircraft at all. In the final days before the atomic bombings, the Mustangs continued to patrol, their missions almost ceremonial. They escorted the bombers that carried out the firebombing of Nagoya, and later the atomic missions themselves. On the morning of August 6, 1945, as the Enola Gay climbed from Tini and toward Hiroshima, P-51s patrolled above the routes, scanning for any remaining Japanese fighters. None appeared. The Empire's skies were silent. That silence was not peace. It was the echo of total defeat. Japan's air power, once a force of awe and pride, had been reduced to memory. From the laughter of officers in 1942 to the disbelief of 1945, the journey had been swift and absolute. The Mustang had not merely won the air war. It had redefined what air war meant. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the end was bitter but undeniable. "We fought with everything," one recalled after the surrender. But they had engines that did not tire, factories that did not sleep, and skies that did not end. As the Allied occupation began, wrecked Zeros lay in fields across the homeland, relics of an age when skill and courage could still challenge machinery. The P-51s, lined up on captured airfields, gleamed in the sunlight, silent witnesses to a revolution forged in metal and fuel. The war in the Pacific was nearly over. But before peace could come, the world would witness the most devastating consequence of the technological supremacy that the Mustang symbolized. When Japan's skies finally went quiet, the silence carried a strange, oppressive weight. It was not peace, only the pause that comes after exhaustion. The Imperial Japanese Air Service, once the embodiment of the nation's modern strength, now existed only in fragments. Broken squadrons, grounded pilots, and the faint echo of engines that would never roar again. In the weeks following August 1945, Allied intelligence officers began compiling reports on Japan's final air operations. What they discovered was staggering. Of the more than 12,000 aircraft Japan had deployed across the Pacific since 1941, barely 1,500 remained by mid-1945, most of them inoperable. Hangars were filled with stripped fuselages. Mechanics resorted to dismantling one plane to repair another. The supply of aviation fuel had collapsed entirely. Many surviving Zeros were drained of fuel and buried to prevent capture. Captured Japanese officers spoke candidly in interrogation rooms on Guam and Okinawa. They no longer spoke of divine winds or inevitable victory. Instead, they described the psychological erosion that came with facing the P-51s. One senior officer admitted, "We stopped fearing the bombers. It was the Mustangs that broke our will. They appeared when we had nothing left to fight with." American reports corroborated it. Pilots returning from Iwo Jima described missions where enemy resistance vanished entirely. By July, one squadron leader wrote, "We weren't escorting, we were policing empty skies." Yet that emptiness carried a strange discomfort. The pilots who once fought for survival now fought against monotony and moral fatigue. There were no duels, no aerial dances, only mechanical destruction. The absence of opposition transformed Allied operations. B-29 raids could proceed without interference, hitting industrial centers, refineries, and transport hubs at will. The precision and consistency of these raids broke what remained of Japan's logistical system. Trains ceased to run between major cities. Communication lines fell silent. Factories that once built aircraft now lay in ruins. Skeletal frameworks surrounded by silent workers who had long since abandoned hope. The U.S. Army Air Forces recognized the shift in tone. Air supremacy was no longer a strategic advantage, it was absolute control. For the first time in history, one nation's air power extended unchallenged over another's homeland. The concept of the battle for the skies had ended. There was no battle left to fight. Still, beneath this mechanical precision lay a growing unease. The Allied command, aware of the devastation it had unleashed, now faced a moral reckoning. General Curtis LeMay's relentless firebombing campaign had incinerated entire cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Mustangs, flying low-level strafing missions against transport lines, often encountered scenes of desperation. Civilians fleeing along roads, soldiers retreating without orders. It was a war that had lost its symmetry. For the Japanese public, the loss of the air war was a psychological collapse as much as a military one. For years, Propaganda had promised that Japanese pilots were unmatched, warriors born of spirit and sacrifice. But when the P-51s appeared, those myths dissolved. Newspapers fell silent about aerial victories. Children who once watched formation flights from schoolyards now saw the contrails of enemy planes above their homes. The sky, once a symbol of divine protection, had turned hostile. After the surrender on August 15, 1945, Allied investigators walked through airfields across Kyushu and Honshu. What they found were graveyards of aviation history. Burned Zeros lay beside Nakajima Ki-84s. Their wings sheared off, their engines seized. Some planes were deliberately wrecked by their own crews. Better to destroy them than see them displayed as trophies. The once proud hangars of Yokosuka and Tachikawa were now filled with silence and soot. In a report compiled weeks later, one American officer wrote, "Their defeat was not sudden, nor was it merely physical. It was spiritual. We did not only destroy their air force, we erased their belief that the sky could belong to them. That belief, that ancient bond between the warrior and the sky, had ended. The Mustang had not just conquered Japan's aircraft, it had conquered the very idea of invincibility that sustained them." But the story of the aftermath was not only about Japan's fall. It was also about the uneasy birth of a new world, one forged in steel, technology, and overwhelming power. As the last smoke lifted from Japan's cities, the Mustang remained more than a machine. It became a symbol of technological supremacy and industrial resolve. Across the Pacific, the aircraft's impact extended beyond the battlefield. Its presence had rewritten strategy, forcing the Japanese to confront the limits of human skill against the relentless efficiency of engineering. The lessons were clear. Innovation, when paired with production capacity, could dominate the most disciplined enemy. American pilots carried their experiences forward. Many joined the occupation forces, documenting tactics, writing manuals, and training new generations. They spoke of the Mustang with reverence, not as a trophy, but as a tool that had saved lives and shortened the war. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley, who had flown over Japan in 1945, described it as an airplane that made you think strategically. To fly it was to fly with purpose. Pilots remembered the long hours over open ocean, the moments of fear and silence, and the sudden clarity when enemy aircraft were intercepted with precision and efficiency. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, reflected on a shattered dream. Survivors spoke of the early days of the war with nostalgia, when the Zero ruled, when skill could decide a duel in the clouds. But by 1945, they faced the undeniable reality that industrial might and engineering foresight had outpaced courage and tradition. Many officers later wrote memoirs detailing both pride and sorrow. Pride in the skill of their pilots, sorrow in the helplessness imposed by technology. One veteran admitted, "We had spirit, we had training, but we could not fight what we could not touch." The Mustang also left its mark on aviation itself. Its laminar flow wing, bubble canopy, and high-altitude performance became reference points for the jet age that followed. Designers studied every aspect of its engineering, from the Merlin engine's efficiency to the airframe's balance and adaptability. Lessons learned from Mustang operations influenced the development of early jet fighters, shaping the future of air warfare for decades. In the broader context, the P-51 embodied the evolution of total war. It demonstrated that superiority was not only measured in bravery, numbers, or doctrine, but in the integration of science, strategy, and sustained production. The Pacific theater had been an arena of extremes: vast distances, brutal climates, and ferocious enemies. Yet, in the Mustang, technology made those extremes manageable. Pilots could fly farther, strike faster, and survive longer than ever before. The skies that had once belonged to the Zero now belonged to a new paradigm, one in which human courage and mechanical precision worked as one. Even decades later, veterans from both sides recounted encounters with the Mustang in interviews. For American pilots, it remained a testament to the synergy of engineering and skill. For Japanese pilots, it was a haunting reminder of what was lost. Not just territory or aircraft, but a sense of invulnerability that had shaped the culture of their air force. The stories shared in post-war memoirs, documentaries, and reunions reinforced a truth that few could have imagined in 1942. the Mustang had not only ended battles but had ended an era. The war's final months also highlighted the stark human cost. While the Mustangs claimed air supremacy with remarkable efficiency, the civilian toll on Japan was staggering. Firebombing raids, strafing missions, and unimpeded bombing campaigns destroyed cities, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and left survivors to grapple with the scale of devastation. The technological triumph of the Mustang was inseparable from the reality of total war, a reminder that progress in warfare often comes with profound human consequences. By the time peace was declared, the Mustang had proven itself on every level: tactical, strategic, psychological, and technological. Its impact reached beyond the Pacific, influencing Cold War aviation doctrines and inspiring a generation of engineers and pilots. The age of propeller-driven fighters was drawing to a close, but the Mustang's legacy endured, a benchmark for precision, endurance, and adaptability. And yet, for those who had flown against it, the memories were deeply personal. American pilots remembered missions over water and fire, the roar of engines, the sight of enemy aircraft vanishing in flames. Japanese pilots remembered the inevitability, the sense of something unstoppable appearing from above, and the bitter lessons learned at high altitude. In both cases, the Mustang remained a symbol, not of victory or defeat alone, but of a war where technology, courage, and endurance converged in the skies over the Pacific. The stage was now set for the war's final chapter, a moment of reflection where the triumph of innovation met the human cost of conflict, and where the story of the Mustang would reach its quiet, enduring conclusion. In the quiet that followed the Pacific War, the P-51 Mustang stood as more than a machine. It was a symbol of what human ingenuity could achieve under the pressure of necessity. For years, Japanese officers had mocked American pilots, confident in the invincibility of their Zeros and the skill of their men. Yet in the clouds above Iwo Jima, Leyte, and Tokyo, that arrogance met a force both relentless and precise. The combination of engineering, strategy, and endurance. The Mustang's triumph was not born of heroics alone. It was the product of decades of innovation, international collaboration, and lessons learned through failure. The design that emerged from a small California factory, strengthened by a British engine and American production, reshaped the very meaning of air supremacy. It proved that technology could redefine combat, that preparation could outmatch tradition, and that human skill, guided by ingenuity, could dominate even the most formidable opponents. Yet the aircraft's legacy is inseparable from the human cost it enforced. Entire cities burned, pilots on both sides faced death daily, and the lives of thousands of civilians were irreversibly altered. The Mustang reminds us that the triumph of innovation carries profound responsibility, the power to win battles and reshape nations, but also to bring devastation. In the end, the story of the Mustang is a story of transformation. It marked the end of the Zero's reign, the collapse of outdated doctrines, and the emergence of a new age in which technology and strategy define victory. For the men who flew it, it was survival, duty, and mastery of the skies. For those who faced it, it was a lesson in humility and the inevitability of progress. The Pacific skies were never the same. Laughter once heard in Japanese command bunkers became silence. And in that silence, the Mustang left its final mark, a testament to the unyielding interplay of courage, invention, and history, a reminder that even the boldest myths must yield to the forces of change.